Our talk today is on a artifact called a codex, and it's called the Smoking Mirror. It's an ancient pictorial of a Mixtec culture of central Mexico. And on the agenda here, we're going to have the origin and construction of the Smoking Mirror Codex, the ownership trail, the scientific tests and conclusions, and the codex description and interpretations. This is the region where this codex came from. It's in the Oaxacan mountains in a small town called Telantongo. And this piece is constructed of a bark fiber. Think of burlap or wire mesh with crushed seashell, cooked in a lime and tree sap and or animal fat. And we can get more into that later with some reports that Michael Coe wrote. And the ink on this was derived from the plants and materials from the indigenous area. This is a magnification of the chalk substrate on the fiber. And in this shot here, this town called Pueblo is where they traveled to get the special bark from this tree that made the burlap type substance. And they traveled a great distance and put, from what I've read, hundreds of people up here gathering this special bark to make this codex. And then crushing up the seashell into the paste and troweling it over the fiber. And as you can see here, this is Michael Coe's page on how the codex was made, and there's like 4 codices of the Mayan group that was made out of this same material of the chalk substrate, the fibers. You can spend a time a little bit reading that. This is the ink magnified 40 and 100 times that's adhered to the chalk substrate. Looks like something from outer space, but it's was taken by McCrone Laboratory, and I was sent the photos of it. It's hard to come up with who made the codex, who actually made it. That's been a long time ago. So I bought the piece from a gentleman in 1969 as a possible reproduction, and I hung it on my wall until 83, 84. And I had a friend of mine ask me if I ever had it carbon date tested, and I wasn't familiar with carbon date testing. And he explained to me carbon date testing, and he says to reproduce something like that, you actually couldn't afford it. It would take a long time to get something to look that old. So we carbon date tested it, and it came back. Well, actually, we did thermoluminescence through a company in Florida, and it came back 1425 BC. And I took it off the wall immediately, covered it up, put it away. Then I found out that that means nothing, the 1425 BC, because that was a shell that was taken off of the beach and crushed into a powder and cooked with lime and animal fat to make it into a plaster. And then they would trowel that plaster over the fiber material from the tree bark on both sides. And they made one side a smooth finish to do their writings on, and that's when they applied the ink. And so then I found out the fiber, after I carbon date tested that was between 1530 and 1550. So I'm going like, wow, it's still old. But then I talked to a gentleman, he said, if you want to cut to the chase, your last application, the ink, will give you the date of when that was completed. Now that shell substrate and that fiber could have laid in a cave like blanks ready for doing more artwork. I don't know, but it sounds reasonable. And the ink was tested by McCrone Laboratory, I believe 10 different samples of ink. And that ink tested out 1710 to 1720. I'd like to bring up Freddie Furlong to explain the scientific testing.
Basically, there have been 4 major tests performed on the piece over the years since Rogers had it. Substrate thermoluminescence, as he described, more carbon-14, and then a real intense polarized light microscopy. They used light to do a bunch of tests, and I'll describe that here in a minute. So in November 1984, they did a substrate thermoluminescence study, and as you can see, it's a form of radiocarbon dating, although it's not carbon-14 dating. It uses different methods of extracting dates. So here we go. So that's what thermoluminescence is. I don't need to read that again. I think you all will admit that it's out there. There's the area that was sampled for thermoluminescence. By the way, they just tested the substrate plaster. And they found that, as Roger mentioned, that the age was 1425 to 610 BC. And I think we'll find out here why. So it indicates the age to be fairly old. The test results do not indicate the actual construction date of the codex, just the date of the material used for the plaster. And since Roger mentioned it already, we know that crushed ancient seashells were used for the plaster base material. That's well known. So that reinforces everything that we're considering here. Here's an actual report from the Alpha Labs that did this. We just threw it up there to make it busy. Here's a definition for the next 2 tests, our radiocarbon-14 test, and there's the actual description of what it is. So in August 2003, they did an analysis of the fiber and did some digital microscopy on that. And they found that the fiber binding aged out to between 1530 and 1680 after the Common Era, or in the Common Era here. The test actually reinforces that the fiber material is more than 330 years old, even though the plaster substrate is older than that because of the ancient seashells. The plant material used in the fiber lining is about 330 years old. So in 2004, another carbon-14 study was done. The main output of this report had to do with the fact that they discovered silk was in each of the folds of the codex to add flexibility to the folds. And since we know that silk was known in Central America since 200 AD, that fits in well with what we're talking about. They were using silk in the years we think this thing was constructed. And the last test, major tests that were done by McCrone Labs, and they used various forms of light energy to study and check this thing out. And basically, a lot of the reports were done on the inks. So they did all those various studies on the ink samples, and I'll show you where they sampled the ink from. And the final bullet there, fact that no modern materials were used in construction, the inks were consistent with colorants from that era. So those are good things. So McCrone sampled 9, they analyzed 9 samples. The chalk surface, they analyzed that and found that it had fossils from unicellular algae in it. That confirms the ancient for the substrate. I'm not sure what the second bullet, the date of early 18th century, that was for the, I believe for the ink. And they detected Prussian blue and vermilion, which were actually available at that time. And they determined that native methods and materials were employed. And they concluded that no modern materials were used in the construction of this piece. The conclusions are from the labs, so that the age of this piece is old. It's 1710 to 1720, probably created by indigenous artists, used original traditions and methods of construction, and they concluded that it was likely to be historically significant. That's right in the McCrone Lab report. So this is to give you an idea of some of the techniques that were used in gathering the samples for the McCrone stuff. It was determined to consult with several labs, select one to do the sampling, prepare the sample site, conduct the sampling process, and then send the reports to the lab. There's a picture of the sampling that was done. This actually shows where the samples came from. There's little numbers here, and they show these little points are where the samples came from. And then that's the slide Roger showed you earlier, where it shows the actual ink on the plaster substrate. This is the official report out of McCrone. It just reinforces what we've been talking about. They really thought that it was genuine. So here's the research summary. Thermonescence showed 1425 to 610 BC. We know that was on the plaster substrate because of this ancient seashells. The carbon date on the fiber showed 1650 to 1720. The FBI labs reports showed silk, which was consistent with other things. And the McCrone ink test showed no modern materials. So the initial review indicates authenticity.